everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We're diving into something I think a lot of you have been interested in, and that's cultural differences, particularly like how to talk about them in English.
It's a big topic.
It is a big topic. We've got some great sources here that do a really good job of not just giving us a bunch of vocab, but really getting to the heart of communicating well across cultures. I think this is something that's so relevant to so many of you out there, whether you are planning a trip abroad or working with international colleagues or, just want to be a more informed global citizen.
Right, exactly.
So our mission today is really to equip you with the essential concepts, the right language, and, a good understanding of why all this even matters. So let's get into it, shall we?
Let's do it. One of the things that struck me as I was looking at this material was this emphasis on being able to talk about cultural differences as a genuine skill, a real asset.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just something nice to have, it's increasingly important. The sources even make the case that this is a key factor in how successful we are in various parts of our lives.
Absolutely. And I think one of the first big reasons why it's so important to talk about cultural differences is that it really helps build global understanding. And I don't just mean like, oh yeah, there are other cultures out there. It's about engaging in those conversations that really promote empathy and respect,
Right, it's not just acknowledging that differences exist, it's actually engaging with them. And I love how the material emphasizes that respectful dialogue is like the foundation for bridging those gaps between us. It helps us see beyond our own limited perspectives.
Totally. When you can actually, thoughtfully discuss cultural practices that are different from your own, it's like you're breaking down these invisible walls, right?
Exactly. And what's amazing is the impact that even simple conversations can have. Our sources point to examples of, international collaborations that were only possible because people were willing to sit down and have these open discussions about their different approaches.
It's so powerful. And it's not just about being a good global citizen or whatever. Our materials also highlight that discussing cultural differences really hones your communication skills. Like, it forces you to be more precise with your language, to use more complex sentence structures, and even to master things like idioms.
Right, those colorful expressions, it can be tricky, but they add so much to communication.
They really do. And, these are all skills that come in handy in so many situations. Whether you're in the workplace or, just in your personal life, being able to communicate effectively across cultures is so valuable.
Absolutely. Think about it. When you're trying to explain a cultural tradition or compare different social norms, you're really flexing your communication muscles.
You really are.
You're refining your ability to express nuanced ideas with clarity, and that's a superpower in any context. And this actually ties in nicely with another benefit that the sources highlight, this idea of personal and professional growth.
Right.
When you can articulate cultural nuances effectively, it shows that you're culturally aware, you're sensitive to those differences, and those are qualities that really make you stand out. Especially, in today's globalized world.
It's true. It really demonstrates an ability to engage with the diverse perspectives, which is so important in academic settings, workplaces, just generally in life.
Exactly. Just look at the job market, for example. Employers are increasingly looking for people who can thrive in multicultural environments. And being able to talk about cultural differences with sensitivity shows that you have that adaptability, that empathy, that willingness to learn. And those are all essential qualities if you want to succeed in, global teams and international projects.
I'm curious, actually, when you think about your own experiences, how often do those kinds of situations come up? Oh, all the time, yeah. And I think this leads us to another really important point. We all know that cultural topics can sometimes be sensitive and delicate.
It can be a minefield, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's precisely why being able to discuss them respectfully is so crucial. It gives you the tools to navigate those tricky conversations, to avoid misunderstandings. And that's so important, especially in workplaces, in international relations, in business ventures that span across borders.
Right. And, the source material actually gives some really helpful guidance on how to approach these more sensitive conversations.
Yeah.
It's all about fostering an environment of open communication where people feel safe sharing their perspectives without fear of causing offense. And that means being very intentional about the language we use and how we approach those conversations.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about why discussing cultural differences is so important, but now let's actually, get into what we mean by cultural differences.
Right, like what are we talking about?
Yeah, exactly. So the sources explain that cultural differences encompass all those diverse ways that people live, think, communicate, and interact with the world.
It's a broad definition for sure.
It is broad, yeah. So how do we make sense of it? Well, one thing the text does is break it down into different elements.
That makes it a bit more manageable, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. So first you have the kind of underlying principles that guide behavior, like values and beliefs.
Right, so what's considered right or wrong, important or unimportant within a certain culture?
Exactly. And then you have the rituals, and celebrations, and everyday practices of a culture, the customs and traditions.
Like how people celebrate holidays, weddings, things like that.
Exactly. And then you have the social norms. And this is something we often don't think about.
Right.
They're like those unwritten rules for how to behave in different social situations.
It's the unspoken etiquette of different cultures.
Yes, exactly. Like, how close do you stand to someone when you're talking to them?
Right, or how do you address someone you've just met? There are so many subtle cues.
Totally. And then, of course, there's language and communication styles, and that goes way beyond just vocabulary.
Right, like body language, tone of voice, those kinds of things.
Exactly. And how you're expected to communicate in different contexts, right?
And let's not forget the art, music, and literature of a culture.
Oh, for sure.
Those creative expressions tell us so much about a culture's history, values, and beliefs. And of course, there's food and cuisine.
Yeah, which is like a whole world in itself, really.
It is. And what's fascinating is how all these different elements kind of connect.
Yeah.
They often reflect deeper values and a shared worldview within a culture.
Yeah.
So for example, a culture that places a high value on community, you might see strong family traditions, a communication style that emphasizes indirectness, and art forms that celebrate collective achievements.
It's all interconnected. So understanding these different ways that cultural differences manifest, it really leads us to this key concept of cultural awareness, right?
Yes, and our sources really stress this.
Yeah.
It's not just about tolerating differences. It's about moving beyond that to a place of genuine appreciation and respect. And that, has so many benefits.
Yeah. What are some of those benefits?
Well, first, as we touched on earlier, it really helps reduce misunderstandings. When we recognize and respect different ways of doing things, we're less likely to misinterpret each other's actions or intentions.
Right. And our interactions with others become so much more meaningful, don't they?
They do. When you approach someone with cultural awareness, you're more likely to connect with them on a deeper level. And I think this is something that's often overlooked, but the sources actually suggest that culturally aware individuals report having more fulfilling personal relationships.
Makes sense. It's about that empathy and understanding, right?
Exactly. And in professional settings, cultural sensitivity is essential for effective teamwork, international business negotiations, building those long-term partnerships.
And of course, on a personal level, experiencing different cultures just enriches your life, expands your horizons, deepens your knowledge, and it really gives you a greater appreciation for the incredible diversity of human experience.
That's a journey of discovery, right? The more culturally aware you become, the more rewarding your experiences are likely to be. And it just fuels your desire to learn and grow even more.
It's a beautiful cycle. Okay, so we've established what cultural differences are, why they're important to talk about. Now let's get practical. How do we actually build the vocabulary we need to have these conversations effectively?
Right, how do we talk about this stuff?
Exactly. Well, the sources provide some really useful guidance here, starting with descriptive adjectives.
Adjectives, the words that paint a picture.
Yes, and there's some really good ones in here. So first up, we have diverse, as in the festival celebrated a diverse range of traditions. It really highlights the variety, the presence of many different elements.
And then there's rich, often used to describe heritage or history, as in the city has a rich cultural heritage with centuries-old landmarks. It suggests abundance, depth.
Right, and then we have vibrant. This one I really like. It just captures that energy, that liveliness.
Yeah, like the marketplace was vibrant, filled with colorful stalls and lively music.
Exactly. And then traditional, which is key when we're talking about long-established customs and practices.
As in, the traditional dance performance captivated the audience.
Yes, perfect. And then, for describing societies or communities, we have progressive, which suggests a willingness to embrace new ideas and change.
And tolerant, meaning open and accepting of different viewpoints and ways of life.
The text gives the example, a tolerant society values diverse cultural expression.
That's a good one. And we also have dynamic for describing things that are constantly evolving and changing, and conservative
Yeah.
for those that tend to favor traditional values and resist change.
Right. And finally, there's inclusive to describe environments that welcome and value people from all backgrounds.
As in, an inclusive community celebrates cultural diversity.
Perfect. So those are some really helpful adjectives to have in your toolkit. And the sources also provide a list of key nouns and phrases that pop up a lot in conversations about culture.
Yeah, these are kind of the foundational terms.
Exactly. So we have cultural heritage, which refers to those traditions, achievements, artifacts, all those things inherited from previous generations.
Right. And then there's customs and traditions, which are the specific practices and rituals passed down within a culture.
And social norms, which are those generally accepted standards of behavior, kind of like the unspoken rules of a society.
And then we have multiculturalism, the presence and interaction of multiple different cultural groups within a society.
And cultural exchange, that process of sharing ideas, values, traditions between different cultures.
And then there's the idea of a global perspective, considering things from a worldwide point of view.
Which is so crucial in today's world.
It is. And then lastly, we have heritage sites. Those places recognized for their historical, cultural, or natural significance.
So those nouns and phrases give us a solid foundation, right?
They really do. And I love how the source actually gives us this great example sentence that brings together a bunch of those terms.
Oh yeah, what is it?
Okay, so it says, I was truly impressed by the multicultural atmosphere at the festival. The event was a vibrant celebration of diverse traditions, showcasing everything from traditional dance and music to modern art installations. The organizers paid homage to cultural heritage by including exhibits on local customs and historical artifacts, making it a rich, inclusive experience that truly celebrated global diversity.
Wow, that's a mouthful, but it really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. It shows how we can use this vocabulary to create a really rich and engaging description.
Totally. Okay, so we have our vocabulary, but how do we actually go about comparing cultures? The sources offer some really helpful sentence structures and expressions for doing this.
Yeah, like some frameworks we can use to make those comparisons.
Exactly. So one basic structure is culture A is more adjective than culture B. And they give the example, Japanese culture is often perceived as more formal than American culture.
A nice straightforward comparison.
Right. And then we have sentences that use while to contrast two cultures, like while culture A emphasizes value, culture B prioritizes value.
And the example given is, while many European societies often value individualism, many East Asian cultures emphasize community and family. It highlights those differing core values.
Exactly. And then we have sentences using compared to draw comparisons, like compared to culture B, culture A is known for its feature.
So you might say, compared to the vibrant and often spontaneous street life in Brazil, Scandinavian countries are generally known for their more reserved public behavior.
Yeah, that's a good one. And then we have sentences using in contrast to highlight differences, like in contrast to culture A, culture B tends to action quality.
Right, so you could say, in contrast to the often more laid-back lifestyle in some Mediterranean countries, the fast-paced work culture in the United States can be quite intense.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so beyond these basic structures, the sources also give us some really colorful idioms and expressions that we often use when talking about cultural differences.
Ah, idioms. Always fun to explore those.
They are. So first up, we have a melting pot. This describes a society where many different cultures blend together.
Right, and often lose some of their distinct characteristics in the process.
Yeah, and they give the classic example. New York City is often described as a true melting pot of cultures.
Makes sense. And then there's cultural mosaic, which describes a society where different cultures coexist but retain their unique identities.
Right. And Canada is often cited as an example of this cultural mosaic model.
And then we have bridging the cultural gap, which refers to those efforts to connect different cultures and promote understanding.
Like language exchange programs, right?
Exactly. Those are great for bridging the cultural gap.
Yeah.
And then there's the phrase rich in heritage, which really emphasizes the deep historical and cultural roots of a place or a group of people.
Yeah, like India is exceptionally rich in heritage with centuries of traditions and artistic expressions.
Beautiful. And lastly, we have this classic contrast between modern and traditional, which often comes up when we're talking about cultural change.
Right, like modern lifestyles in urban areas often present a stark contrast to the traditional values prevalent in more rural communities.
It's a dynamic that plays out all over the world, really. Okay, so now let's get into the nitty-gritty of discussing specific cultural practices and traditions. The sources give us a helpful framework for approaching these conversations in a respectful and informative way.
Oh, that's so important. It's easy to make mistakes here.
It is. So the first step is to clearly identify the specific cultural practice you're talking about. They use the example of Diwali, the Hindu festival of lights celebrated in India and by many other communities worldwide.
Okay, so start with the basics.
Exactly. And then it's important to provide some historical context. So for Diwali, you might talk about the symbolism of light over darkness, the tradition of lighting diyas or oil lamps and setting off fireworks.
Right, give people some background and then...
And perhaps most importantly, you explain the significance of the tradition. What does it mean to the people who celebrate it?
Yeah, get to the heart of it.
Exactly. So for Diwali, you might explain that it's not just a visual spectacle. It's also a time for family reunions, exchanging gifts, and a renewal of positive energy.
It's about those deeper meanings. So identify the practice, give context, explain the significance. That's a good recipe.
It is. And another tip that the sources emphasize is the power of sharing personal experiences when you're talking about culture.
Oh, that's so true. It brings it to life.
It does. Sharing a personal anecdote, like describing your own experience celebrating Diwali with your family, talking about the feelings, the memories associated with it, it adds a human touch to the conversation.
It makes it relatable.
Exactly. And of course, comparing and contrasting your experiences with those of others can lead to some really interesting insights.
Definitely. Okay, so throughout all of these conversations about culture, we have to remember that respect is key.
Absolutely paramount.
And the sources provide some really good tips for ensuring that our communication is respectful.
Yeah, like practical guidelines.
Exactly. So first off, maintain a respectful tone throughout the conversation.
Right, which means being mindful of your language, striving for neutrality.
Don't use words or phrases that could be interpreted as judgmental or critical.
Right. Instead of implying that one cultural practice is better or worse than another, focus on how different practices offer unique perspectives and solutions.
And be super aware of stereotypes. Remember that individual experiences within any culture can vary widely.
Exactly. Avoid making sweeping generalizations about entire groups of people. There's so much diversity within every culture.
Absolutely. And the sources also talk about acknowledging cultural complexity. Recognizing that cultures aren't static, they're constantly evolving.
Right. And traditions, norms, these can vary significantly, even within a single country.
Due to regional differences, historical influences, socioeconomic factors. And a really good way to show respect is to encourage open dialogue.
Yeah, invite others to share their experiences and perspectives.
It shows that you're genuinely interested in understanding where they're coming from.
Absolutely. And a final tip, which I thought was really useful, is to use I statements when you're talking about your observations and opinions.
Oh, yeah, I like that.
It helps you avoid sounding like you're making definitive pronouncements about an entire culture.
Right. So instead of saying, this culture is, you might say, based on my experience, I observed that.
Exactly. Or use phrases like, I believe, or in my view, to show that you're speaking from your own personal perspective.
Those are such good tips.
They are. They really encourage us to approach these conversations with humility, genuine curiosity, and a willingness to learn from each other.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about why discussing cultural differences is so important, how those differences manifest, the vocabulary we need to talk about them, how to compare cultures effectively, and how to do all of this with respect.
It's been a comprehensive deep dive.
It has. And I hope that this has equipped our listeners with a much deeper and more nuanced understanding of how to navigate these increasingly important conversations.
Me too. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. Your own background, your own unique experiences, they're all part of this incredible tapestry of human culture. Use your language skills not just to understand others, but also to share your own story in a way that builds connections and fosters mutual respect.
Beautifully said.
And remember, understanding cultural differences, it's not a destination, it's a journey. It's an ongoing process of exploration and discovery.
A lifelong adventure. And as the sources point out, there are so many resources out there for those of you who want to keep learning and exploring this fascinating topic.
Definitely. But ultimately, the real value lies in engaging in those cross-cultural exchanges, building meaningful connections, and broadening our understanding of the world and each other.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise.
Until next time.